All right. Hi, everyone. It's delightful to be with you today to be discussing this particularly rich and juicy set of chapters from Trollope's He Knew He Was Right. Some of you know that I teach and write in areas of family law and gender and law. And so Trollope is a treasure trove in his many novels of plots about family and marriage and courtship, family dynamics, household dynamics, and the like. So in this particular set of chapters from He Who Was Right, we have 4 different courtship and marriage plots, which are either resolved in some way or approach resolution. All 4 of these have had various obstacles, as we've seen over the course of the book so far. And so Dorothy Stanbury gets her aunt's approval after the aunt's initial disapproval to marry Brooke Burgess. Charles Glasscock has been accepted by Caroline Spaulding. Even though Mrs. Raleigh still has hopes that maybe Nora will somehow prevail, Nora Raleigh and Hugh Stanbury are determined to go forth despite parental objection. And Arabella French once again emerges as the favorite of Reverend Gibson to the utter fury of her sister Camilla. So other major plot developments, we go back to the dreary main plot about Lewis and Emily. The Raleighs learn news of Lewis in Italy, and that's one of 2 reasons they travel over the Alps. The other being that Mrs. Raleigh still has some hopes of somehow snaring Mr. Glasscock for her daughter Nora. And once they get to Florence, where I understand the Trollope Society is soon going, Mr. Glasscock and Sir Marmaduke visit Lewis at Casalunga after getting some information about his whereabouts. And that sets the stage for Emily finally seeing her son after this long separation. And by chapter 84, the last chapter for today, Lewis is prepared to return custody of their child to Emily. Okay, so the major themes in these chapters that I'd like to suggest is first, who knows they're right and who's capable of changing their mind? A second theme is control and mastery. What kind of conflicts develop and continue during these chapters, and how are these conflicts resolved? For example, one of the opening chapters of this series is Hugh approaching Sir Marmaduke to try to discuss Sir Marmaduke's rather rude dismissal of his suit for Nora. And then there's conflict between Nora and her parents over her plans to marry Hugh. There is conflict between Wallachia Petrie and Caroline, and then between Caroline and Mr. Glasscock, and implicitly Wallachia and Mr. Glasscock over where Caroline is right to marry Mr. Glasscock. There is conflict between Dorothy and Aunt Stanbury over Brooke Burgess's marriage proposal, which is happily resolved. And of course, there's conflict between Lewis Trevlin and the entire world concerning the custody of his child and whether he's right in his views about his wife, Emily. And finally, there's conflict between Mr. Gibson and Camilla, and then Mr. Gibson and Mrs. French. So let's start with one of the happier set of chapters in this series, and that is Dorothy. Dorothy Stanbury and Brooke Burgess. Martha, one of the servants of Aunt Jemima Stanbury, has been sent on a very delicate mission to deliver a basket of lamb and wine with a very nice tablecloth. And she can't exactly say that her mistress desperately wants Dorothy to return home, but on the other hand, when she's asked candidly about it, she says basically there's nothing on earth her mistress wanted so much as to have her favorite niece back again. And when Dorothy does come back, she knows she has to tell her aunt that she's just now accepted Brooke Burgess, who Martha actually encounters in passing. And she's prepared just to stay for a day because she knows that this may lead to conflict. But Aunt Stanbury doesn't want Dorothy to leave her, saying, "You don't know how dear you are to me. I'd rather part with Brooke than you." So she really, really does love Dorothy. And in this, Dorothy goes to bed, not sure how it's all going to work out, very troubled that just when she thinks she's going to have heaven on earth in the form of marriage to Brooke, her aunt doesn't approve, and maybe she should give Brooke up because maybe her aunt will cut him out of her will. And as you know, Brooke says, I'm not going to live my life based on what someone may or may not do in their will. But happily, in the middle of the night, she has a visitation from her aunt, who declares, I've thought it over, and you shall be Brooke's wife. I will have it here, and we will all be friends. So Dorothy is moving toward paradise. She's going to have Brooke, and she's going to have her aunt. Okay. And here's just some illustrations from the Gutenberg illustrations that are available online. Dorothy, this is an earlier chapter. Dorothy makes up her mind, and an earlier picture of Aunt Stanbury. And here's Anna Massey in her wonderful performance as Aunt Stanbury. So I just want to say here that one of the things I love so much about this plot is it's a form of household intimacy and closeness that's beyond marriage. When Dorothy goes back to her aunt's, she realizes how many small, delicate comforts her aunt has arranged for her in her room. And there's even the Aunt Stanbury wondering if Brooke thinks she's as pretty as Aunt Stanbury thinks she is. And then the aunt says to her that it was her looks that won her first, like an old fool. It's so pleasant to have a little nature after such a deal of artifice. And you all know, of course, that it's that false hair that particularly drives Aunt Stanbury crazy. And that's why the French sisters are so appalling, even to Mr. Gibson with respect to Arabella. And Aunt Stanbury, by the end of these chapters, is even willing to have Dorothy's brother Hugh back, the black sheep, to be welcome for the wedding. So Dorothy seems to be moving in on having everything work out for her. And it's a hilarious line where Dorothy's writing to Nora, her future sister-in-law, saying, perhaps you wear a chignon. If you do, it must not be large if you come to see Aunt Stanbury. And here's just some photographs or sketches of chignons. So that's our first marriage plot. The second concerns Nora and Hugh. And I'm sorry, well, I'm not sure which order to do, but we'll see. So the Raleighs go over the Alps in search of Lewis, and secretly also for Mrs. Raleigh, hoping to find Charles Glasgow and have a second chance. And we learn they visit the Duomo, they go out, and Lady Raleigh keeps hoping to run into Mr. Glasscock. So as fate would have it, just as Mrs. Raleigh is getting her hopes up that there's still a chance for Nora, she finds out that in fact, Mr. Glasscock is engaged to Caroline Spaulding, an American. And there ensues a hilarious mix-up about who the future Lady Peterborough is. Now, I take this to have a couple different meanings. One, is it absolutely clear it's too late for Nora? Because Lady Raleigh still thinks that Nora can beat out Caroline Spaulding, particularly when she thinks that Wallachia Petrie is really Caroline Spaulding. So the answer is it is too late for Nora. Even though Nora has a few small regrets, she still is going to stick with her conviction to marry Hugh, and she's happy for Caroline and for Charles. And there's comic confusion of Caroline Spaulding with Wallachia Petrie, where Mrs. Raleigh is more and more incredulous that an English aristocrat could possibly think of marrying someone with the views and opinions and looks of Wallachia Petrie. So in this series of chapters, Caroline starts to have doubts about her decision. She worries that his peers will despise him and wonders, can a British lord really marry an American? And Charles simply says, well, somebody must be first. And, Trollope wrote about several plots involving American women marrying British aristocrats, and this is just one of them. There's another, of course, in The Duke's Children, where Plantagenet's firstborn son marries Isabel von Cassen. So there's a battle for Caroline waged between Wallachia and Mr. Glasscock. And on this theme of mastery, Caroline says, you must be master, I suppose, whether you're right or wrong. A man always thinks himself right and have his own way. And there's this sort of theme of battle that somehow Charles Glasscock has gone to war with Wallachia for Caroline, and Caroline is now his captive, as he put it, making us think of things like bride capture, perhaps. And to me personally, I don't know what you thought about it, one of the most annoying parts of this chapter is Caroline becomes childlike in her retelling to Nora what happened, saying, I promised to be a good girl. I promised never to pretend to have an opinion of my own. And he told me to behave just as you would do a little girl. So we go from a fear that Charles Glasscock is too soft as a man to Caroline concluding he's actually quite firm and quite hard, which I suppose is a good thing. But it also does deal with these kind of tropes of childlikeness, which, at least to a modern day reader, and perhaps to some Victorian readers at the time, was a little troubling. So we definitely get a taste in these chapters about Trollope's antipathy for women's rights during this period. In his declaration of the nonfiction book North America, he declared that a woman's best right was to a husband, and he expressed concern that equality and women's rights would harm chivalry. Well, Wallachia hates chivalry and wants equality, right? And Wallachia also sort of in this caricature reflects Trollope's distaste for some American women who champion women's rights. And in the nasal twang that the narrator talks about, and that Mrs. Raleigh notices, we might think back to some of Frances Trollope's criticisms of Americans in her own travel memoir. So Wallachia is committed to abolitionism. And we see this when Caroline sort of irreverently appropriates an anti-slavery slogan in saying of Mr. Glasscock, though he is to be Lord, still he is a man and a brother, leading Wallachia to say, Caroline, you're already learning to laugh at principles which have been dear to you since you left your mother's breast. So there's a kind of showdown between Caroline and Wallachia over whether Charles is acceptable, whether Caroline would be accepted by British society, and the like. And in the end, as we see, Mr. Glasscock is master, and it's clear that Wallachia has lost. And there's a wonderful passage at the end of chapter 81 where she reflects that it's a terrible thing that the chosen one of her heart should prefer the career of an English lord's wife to that of an American citizeness with all manner of capability for voting. Not exactly true in the United States for another 60 or 70 years, by the way. Female speech making, female poetizing, and perhaps female political action before her. And she basically says she would never make this mistake again. She wouldn't have a friend in the future, but she had to make a sacrifice, and there was no point wasting her words on Caroline. So she's sort of giving her protege up, recognizing in a sense she's failed. So let's talk a little bit about Wallachia. As I said in one of our early discussions just in the chat, in the BBC version, this otherwise wonderful version of this novel, they just totally truncate the role of Wallachia as an opponent to the marriage, and there's very little screen time. It's certainly not clear she's an ardent abolitionist and proponent of women's rights. So Trollope calls her the Republican Browning, and perhaps assume referencing Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, in Trollope novels, he several times calls various women Republicans. This is not a complete list, but when Lady Glencora declares to Mr. Monk that the Liberal Party should be fully supportive of equality, including rights for women, he thinks maybe she's carrying it a little too far. And when Mr. Kennedy leads her into dinner, the narrator comments he had the little Republican on his arm. So we use this Republican there. They also use the term Republican to refer to Isabel Boncassen. So it's sort of a synonym for American women who might advocate more, radical ideas of equality than their British counterparts. So the Oxford World Classics edition of He Knew He Was Right suggests that possible models for Wallachia were the prominent abolitionist and women's rights advocate Wendell Phillips, an American who lectured extensively, including during times that Trollope would have been familiar with, he argued that women should have the right to choose for themselves their professions, their educations, and their sphere, right? And if you look at this language, you'll find similar statements about the rights of women in the English Women's Journal from the 1850s and 1860s, and obviously John Stuart Mill. So that's one possible source for Wallachia, who is, after all, an abolitionist. Oxford World Classics also suggests the poet Lizzie Doughton, who sort of communicated with the spirit world, might be another example, since Wallachia is a fairly successful poet. And of course, Kate Field, who's been thought to be a model for just about every powerful woman in Trollope's books. But Trollope first met Kate Field in Florence in 1860, where his mother and his brother Tom lived. As you know, he describes Field as a ray of light in his autobiography, and their friendship is one of the chief pleasures which graced his later years. Possibly a source for Wallachia, although it's a very caricatured portrait of a women's rights advocate. But Kate Field was an actress, a journalist, a singer, a lecturer. She actually had a long-term same-sex relationship with Lillian Whiting as well. So that's another possibility. And I just pulled out a couple of quotes about Kate Field's influence on Trollope. Robert Polhamus says that she was a great source for the glorious fictional projection of the American girl. You read in He Knew He Was Right and The Duke's Children. And while it would be silly to say that she is Wallachia Petrie, he suggests there wouldn't be a Wallachia or a Caroline without his relationship with Kate Field. So that's something to ponder. Okay, so moving a little more quickly now, so I don't run totally out of time. Hugh and Nora. In a wonderful scene with Sir Marmaduke, Hugh defends the profession of journalists and newspapers by stressing their power, suggesting they're even more powerful than the leaders of the country, the political leaders. And this is a theme in Trollope going all the way back to the warden, where the poor warden is kind of pilloried in the press, leading him to want to give up his living. And there's an interesting showdown between Hugh and Sir Marmaduke, where Sir Marmaduke thinks he's always thought that when a gentleman has a duty to abandon his vain pursuit when the head of the family tells him he'll not be welcome, whereas Hugh says, I've been brought up to think that you have a duty to stick with a woman when you've won her affection. So that's kind of a plot that isn't resolved in these chapters, except it's clear that Nora does not want to go back to the islands with her family, and that Hugh is determined to stand by her. And there's a chapter where Nora and Caroline become friends, and Nora says, we shall be so poor, kind of comparing the life Nora and her husband, her future husband, will live with that of Caroline and Lord Glasscock. So in these various scenes, these various chapters, I'm interested in what type of lessons Trollope's teaching about what makes for a good marriage or what makes for household governance of a good kind. Wallachia compares a man's chivalry in speaking of a woman to how a man speaks of a dog, with affection, but with contempt. And previously in the novel, Nora and Emily have been talking about the unfortunate condition of women in England, particularly married women, talking about the life of a dog or something like that. Now, also, what do you think of Charles Glasscock's joke response to Wallachia about she assumes that English gentlemen don't hit women? And he said, we would only strike a lady on strong provocation. And with respect to a wife, it's permitted with a switch no thicker than his thumb. Okay, so this is an allusion to William Blackstone's classic account of coverture marriage, the husband's right to physically correct his wife. It's a little jarring to find this, but we assume this is just Glasscock playing along with Wallachia's assumptions about English men. Glasscock asserts he'll be master in the house, Nora will be mistress, assuming some kind of a partnership. And some people writing about this book have contrasted Lewis's tyranny with the more gentle husbandly rule of Charles Glasscock, Hugh Stanbury, or Brooke Burgess. And that raises the question of what we might call soft patriarchy. Are these the most egalitarian marriages that Trollope can imagine for younger men and women? Perhaps the most egalitarian marriage in all of Trollope's books, some have suggested, is the marriage of Madame Max, a widowed businesswoman, and Phineas Finn. Okay, more briefly, Mr. Gibson, here he is in happier times, sitting there where Arabella's chignon is growing larger and larger in his imagination. Mr. Gibson escapes Camilla and returns to Arabella. He tells Camilla by letter that he feels a duty to inform her that were I to become your husband, I should not make you happy. He is totally wretched and wants a way out desperately, right? And here's just a photo for the BBC adaptation where you see David Tennant torn between these two sisters, with Camilla looking awfully possessive there, holding onto his arm while Arabella looks lovingly at him. And there's the great scene with the carving knife, where she's so worked up that she's prepared to kill everyone, especially her sister. And in the BBC adaptation, when the uncle comes to take her away, she says everybody she's going to stab, and he says, "That's a lot of stabbing. You best get to it." And of course, she crumbles as soon as she, takes one step toward it. So this is sort of a dramatic plot that's resolved by sending her off to her uncle's so the marriage plot can advance. And notably, the narrator is fairly critical of Mr. Gibson, pointing out that within a little more than a year, Mr. Gibson took pride to himself and thought he was a gay deceiver. And he even comes to believe that Dorothy herself was once devotedly in love with him. So what a success he is with women, right? And the narrator doesn't know who to pity more, Mr. Gibson or the unfortunate poor woman who ultimately became Mrs. Gibson. Okay, finally, our final plot. Louis finally sees his mother, and there's a very sensitive description by Trollope of the feelings of this small child on seeing his mother after such a long separation. And it's a very sort of poignant picture of the melancholy this little child feels, where he didn't think he was ever again going to have the luxury of these woman-given happinesses in his life. He didn't dream that she'd actually come to rescue him from the terrible condition he's in. But even at this point, in Lewis's thought process, he's still demanding her penitence. She says, "Can't we just forgive and move on?" But he somehow thinks she wants to forgive him, where he believes he's the one that sins against. It's for him to forgive her. But later that night, he reflects on all of these things, saying rather dramatically, there's a curse on him that no one will ever love him. And even little Louis, for whom he's gotten all these elaborate toys, just isn't happy. He's melancholy, silent, and repressed, and an unhappy little fellow. And you see, this depiction of this little child just looking very tentatively and not looking sort of like an active little child. And he concludes that even though he can't admit he's wrong and he cannot yield, he's willing to sacrifice himself, and as a mercy to his son and the mothers of the son, return Louis to the mother's custody. And chapter 84 finds him writing a letter to that effect. So before we break into small groups, just some food for thought. And that is, how do the different characters who've been tyrannical or attempted to assert mastery compare? Who is able to stay in relationship and who is excluded? And one commentary on this novel from the anthology, The Politics of Gender, suggests that both Miss Jemima Stanbury and Wallachia are seen as taking up inappropriately husband-like roles in relationship to Dorothy and to Caroline Spaulding. On the other hand, whereas it's clear that Wallachia would not feel at home at Monkham's and cannot be part of Caroline's new marital household, even though Caroline seems to wish it, and Mr. Glascock certainly can't imagine her there. It's clear that Dorothy very much wants Aunt Stanbury to be part of her marital household, and she's sad to think that she and Brooke may have to move to London and leave her aunt's home, which has really been her home. So Aunt Stanbury, through her flexibility and her ability to yield, is able to retain a very close and important relationship, whereas Wallachia and Caroline are really going to have a parting of the ways, because it's just not possible for that relationship to expand to include a marriage to Charles Glascock. Camilla, with her threats of violence, is going to be sent away to her uncle's in order for Bella's marriage plot to resume. And we don't know yet whether there's going to be any place for Camilla in her sister's new marital home. And finally, Louis can't imagine moving back to England because he's afraid they'll try to institutionalize him. So he can't yet imagine a reunited family unit, even though Emily tries to persuade him that they could all go back together. And so for small group discussion, here's a few things you might talk about. You could talk about any or none of this, which is who knows they're right in these chapters and who's capable of changing their mind? What sort of conflicts develop during these chapters and how are they resolved? And based on this, what lessons do you think Trollope is trying to teach his readers about how to form and sustain good relationships? So I'll stop there, Dominic.